A missing Navy SEAL lay dying in a barren gravel hollow outside quiet Bramble Falls, his lips split, his wrists marked, his last strength sinking into the dry, merciless wind. No one was looking there. No one knew he had escaped. Until a 28-year-old FBI agent and her German Shepherd stopped on that empty trail, and the dog refused to take another step. If you believe God still leads the faithful to the forgotten, leave amen. Early spring came carefully to Bramble Falls, as if the town had earned gentleness after a long season of cold. The old snow was shrinking into thin white ribbons along the ditches, the lake shone under a pale northern sun, and the birch trees still held a silver chill in their bark. The town itself sat near the water like a folded postcard from another decade, bright clapboard houses, a diner with a red sign, church windows catching the morning light, and narrow roads that curved past boat sheds, pine stands, and forgotten industrial lots. It was beautiful in the honest American way, not grand, not fashionable, but clean with memory and stubborn with peace. That was why Mara Quinn had always found it dangerous. Places that looked this gentle were often the last places people thought to question. At 28, Mara had the composed face of a woman who had learned early not to waste movement. She was a little above average height, lean and athletic, with strong shoulders hidden beneath a simple ash-gray jacket and dark jeans that made her look more like a local woman out for a morning walk than an FBI agent from Albany. Her hair, chestnut brown with a hint of copper in the light, was pulled into a low ponytail. Her skin had the fair tone of someone raised in northern winters, and her eyes were a cool hazel that turned almost green when she was thinking hard. Most people first noticed how calm she seemed. The better observers noticed the second thing. Calm was not the same as ease. A recent federal operation had left a mark on her, not on her body, but in the private machinery of her thoughts. 2 Navy SEALs had been brought out alive. The third had vanished. Since then, sleep had become a shallow guest. Walking beside her was June Halpern, the friend who knew how to speak into silence without breaking it. June was 29, sturdy and warm-faced, with short, honey-blonde hair tucked behind one ear and freckles scattered across her cheeks like pale cinnamon. She worked as a paramedic in the county and carried herself with the quick, practical grace of someone used to lifting stretchers, calming strangers, and reading fear before it formed into words. She laughed easily, but not cheaply. There was steadiness in her, the kind that made people tell her the truth without meaning to. That morning she wore a navy quilted vest over a green sweater, hiking boots still dusted with salt from old snow, and she held a paper coffee cup in one hand as if it were a second pulse. Atlas moved ahead of them on a short lead, quiet as a thought. He was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, large even for his breed, with a sable coat that darkened along his back and softened into warm brown around the chest and legs. His ears stood high and alert, his muzzle noble and sharp, and his amber eyes held that uncanny working dog intelligence that could make a person feel both protected and measured. Atlas was not restless. He did not need to prove himself. His confidence had the patient gravity of a seasoned soldier. People tended to smile when they saw him, then instinctively lower their voices. Even Joy knew how to stand straighter around him. They followed a trail that ran along the lake before bending toward a stand of birches and a rough road leading out past an old gravel lot. Mara had returned to Bramble Falls under the official fiction of leave, though both she and her supervisor knew it was not truly leave at all. A burner phone tied to a wider federal inquiry had pinged only once near this region, then gone dark. The signal was too brief for a full operation, too thin for public action, but too close to the last known thread of the missing SEAL to ignore. Mara had grown up near enough to this country to understand its hidden grammar. Logging paths mistaken for dead ends, factory shells with back roads no map bothered to note, private parcels stitched together like old quilts. If something had slipped into the folds of this place, she knew where folds liked to form. June, who knew nearly everybody within 50 miles, either by name or ambulance run, kept her voice casual as she shared the kinds of details that rarely made it into official reports. A delivery driver had shown up at urgent care last week with a split lip and a story that changed twice in 10 minutes. A shuttered warehouse outside town had lights on after midnight, 3 nights in a row. A pair of long-haul trucks had been seen taking the Forest Service Road instead of the main highway, which made no sensible business difference at all. 2 recent emergency calls had been filed as minor work accidents, though the injuries sounded more like panic and exhaustion than clumsiness. Nothing dramatic, nothing clean, just enough to make the morning feel slightly off-center. Mara listened, asked small questions, and kept her gaze moving. She trusted June's instincts because June noticed what institutions often missed: pauses, stammers, false cheer, the shape of a lie before it found language. Still, the beauty of the morning kept trying to argue with her suspicion. The lake breeze smelled of wet pine and thawing earth. Somewhere farther off, someone was hammering a dock plank back into place. The sky was so clear it almost looked innocent. A sudden crack of wings burst from the birches, and Atlas stopped so sharply that the leash drew a clean line through the cold air. For one suspended heartbeat, even the light seemed to hold still. Then he turned, not with curiosity, but with decision. His head lowered, his body shifted forward. He pulled once, hard enough that Mara's hand tightened at once on the lead. "Atlas," she said softly, but he was already moving off the trail toward the abandoned gravel lot beyond the trees. June set down her coffee on a stump without a word. The mood changed in a breath. Morning walk became search. Small talk became silence. The lot had once belonged to some old extraction site, a wide patch of gray stone and packed dirt, rimmed by low scrub and wind-bent brush. Meltwater had gathered in shallow silver pools. Beyond the far edge, the land dipped into a shallow basin, partly hidden by dead grass and young pine. Atlas guided them there with eerie certainty, weaving once around a cluster of brush before descending into the hollow. Mara's pulse quickened, though her face stayed still. She had seen that posture in him before. Not threat, not prey, human distress. The man lay half on his side against the cold ground, one arm twisted close to his body as if he had tried to protect himself, even in collapse. His clothes were torn and crusted with dirt. His boots were scraped nearly white at the toes. He was broad-shouldered beneath the damage, the build of a man trained to endure, though endurance had plainly asked too much of him. His dark hair was matted at the temple, his jaw rough with several days of beard, and his face had the hollowed look of severe dehydration, cheekbones sharpened, lips dry, skin drawn tight with weakness. Faint bruising shadowed one side of his neck and wrist. Even in that broken state, there was something unmistakably disciplined in him, as if hardship had bent the body but not erased the architecture beneath. Mara dropped to one knee and felt the world narrow. "Jonah," she breathed. "Lieutenant Jonah Vance. 35. The missing man, the one who had never come back." June was already beside them, all warmth gone from her face, replaced by clean professional focus. She checked his airway, pulse, pupils, skin temperature, speaking in low, precise phrases as her hands moved fast through the ritual of rescue. Mara helped where she could, but her thoughts were running ahead, stumbling over the same impossible fact. He was here, not in a safe house, not across a border, not in a morgue. Here, in a gravel hollow outside a town where children would be buying maple candy by noon. Atlas settled close against Jonah's side, not touching at first, only guarding, watching the man's face with an attention so deep it seemed almost tender. Jonah stirred once. His eyelids fluttered. When he tried to speak, the first attempt broke into air. Mara leaned closer, catching the dry, ragged whisper on the second try. "Not accident." A swallow, a wince. "Battery." Another breath, thin as thread. "Harlem." June looked up sharply. Mara felt something cold pass through her, colder than the melting ground beneath her knee. This was no lost survivor wandering out of the woods. He was a message someone had failed to bury. The call for the air ambulance went out over June's radio, clipped and urgent. Minutes later, the distant thrum reached them from above the trees, faint at first, then fuller, beating through the bright morning like a second heart. Wind began to move through the basin. Dust trembled. Atlas turned his head toward the deeper woods rather than the sky, his ears rigid, as if some part of him knew the forest still held the shape of what had happened here. Mara looked at Jonah as the rescue crew descended, then at Atlas, then toward the dark line of trees beyond the gravel lot. She had arrived in Bramble Falls telling herself this was observation, a quiet return, a careful look at shadows. But as the helicopter settled into the northern light and the town's peaceful morning shivered around its noise, she understood with perfect clarity that her leave was over before it had begun. Whatever had brought Jonah Vance to that hollow had not ended. It had only just found her. By late afternoon, Jonah Vance had been moved into a federal medical safe site hidden behind the plain face of a county rehabilitation wing 20 miles south of Bramble Falls. From the parking lot, the building looked harmless enough, a square brick structure with narrow windows and a flag moving lazily in the pale wind. But inside, the quiet had a different weight. 2 armed federal officers stood at separate checkpoints, and every door opened with a coded card and a small green flash. Mara sat in a chair near the observation glass, with Atlas stretched at her boots, his sable coat catching the thin hospital light in bands of brown and black. He looked restful, but she knew better. His ears twitched at every cartwheel, every distant footstep, every rise and fall in Jonah's breathing. Mara had changed into a dark sweater and a clean pair of slacks, though she still felt as if the gravel cold from that morning clung to her skin. Across the hall, Dr. Eleanor Shaw reviewed a chart beneath a wall lamp. Eleanor was in her early 50s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with silver-threaded black hair pinned into a severe knot, and a face made finer by years of controlled concern. She had the kind of intelligence that did not need to announce itself. Her voice stayed low, her hands never rushed, and there was something almost maternal in the way she tucked a blanket corner back into place after checking a bandage. She told Mara the truth in plain words. Severe dehydration, exposure, soft tissue trauma, exhaustion, and the deeper injury no scan could capture yet. "He can talk in short windows," she said, "but only if he feels safe." Mara glanced through the glass. Jonah looked older than 35 while he slept, not in the face, but in the stillness of him. Even after fluids and warmth, he seemed held together by discipline more than strength. When Jonah woke the first time, it was not dramatic. His eyelids lifted a fraction, then fully, like a man surfacing through dark water with care not to lose the air he had just found. Mara went in alone at first. Atlas remained by the open doorway with 1 federal officer, though the dog leaned forward the whole time, watching Jonah with grave attention. Up close, Jonah's features had returned a little to themselves. He was a broad-built man with deep-set gray-blue eyes and a face cut in hard American lines, strong nose, square jaw, dark blonde hair now washed clean, but still lying flat from fever. Bruising lived at the edge of one temple and along the wrist where restraints had once bitten into the skin. There was no self-pity in him, only fatigue and the strained patience of someone trying to decide what could be said before consciousness slipped again. Mara introduced herself properly, though he knew her already. He remembered enough of the operation to know she had been on the support side of the failed extraction. That knowledge passed between them like an old bruise neither needed to touch with words. Jonah swallowed, gathered breath, and began in fragments. He said the 3-man SEAL unit had not been sent after ordinary criminals. The target had been a covert logistics line moving through civilian channels, hidden among legal deliveries, repair shipments, and short-haul warehouse transfers. The work had crossed into federal and national security territory because one package, disguised inside an e-bike battery in Harlem, had carried far more than contraband. It had contained encrypted routing data, payment layers, dead drop schedules, and a list of transfer points reaching farther north than anyone first believed. Mara felt the line of the case tighten inside her. The terrible crash in Harlem had not been a wild, isolated horror. It had been noise, maybe even useful noise, a wall of chaos behind which people had moved something valuable out of sight. Jonah paused often, his voice thinning, and Dr. Shaw stepped in twice to make him drink from a straw. On his third clear stretch, he filled in the shape of the failure. Their mission had been reconnaissance and recovery, not assault. They were to enter a suspected satellite site, confirm whether the network had relocated sensitive materials to the northern corridor, extract whatever could be taken cleanly, and leave. No glory, no fireworks, just precision. Instead, they walked into a place that had been waiting for them. There had been thermal coverage where there should not have been any, signal disruption strong enough to choke their comms, and maintenance corridors twisting under the main structure like roots beneath rotten floorboards. The site had not been just a storage point. It had been engineered as a trap. Worse, civilians were inside, laborers forced to move materials they did not understand, plus at least one living witness being held for leverage. "We couldn't go loud," Jonah said, his gaze fixed not on Mara, but on a point over her shoulder, as if the memory still burned too bright to face directly. Too many innocents. One teammate had been badly hurt helping a witness toward an emergency breach. Another had made it into the first extraction window when backup clipped the edge of the site. Jonah had chosen to stay behind and hold pursuit long enough for both to get out. He said it simply, without heroism, which made the truth heavier. Mara understood then that his survival had not been luck wearing a soldier's face. It had been choice paid for in days of misery. A metal tray clattered somewhere down the corridor, sharp and bright as a snapped wire, and for a breath the whole room seemed to flinch around the sound. Jonah's fingers jerked against the blanket. Atlas rose instantly at the door, silent, rigid, listening. The stillness after that noise opened something. Jonah spoke more plainly, though each sentence cost him. The men who held him had not kept him alive out of mercy. He had seen faces he should not have seen, heard names that belonged in boardrooms and development councils rather than in an old industrial cage. Someone above street level was financing movement, shielding routes, buying confusion where needed. Jonah had also glimpsed the location of a mirrored data cache, not the full contents, but enough to know its value. That was why they had pressed him. That was why they had moved him through the shell of an abandoned paper mill complex near Bramble Falls, using only part of the upper works while ignoring the deeper maintenance channels beneath. He explained how he had escaped in the most economical way possible. A failing generator cycle, a blind corner near an old service drain, one careless guard, rain, darkness, and pain enough to make memory feel like a cracked mirror. He had not escaped well. He had only escaped far enough to collapse where Atlas found him. By then, his lips had gone pale. Dr. Shaw touched Mara's elbow and gave a slight nod. Time was ending. Mara asked one final question, softly. "Did you hear anything else? Anything unusual?" Jonah's eyes had already begun to lose focus, but he frowned as if listening inward. Then, from some buried chamber of thought deeper than pain, he murmured a single word. It was soft, foreign at the edges, older than the rest of the room. Mara did not know the language, but Atlas did something that made the blood leave her face. From the far end of the room, the German shepherd lifted his head, stood, and then sat down in perfect stillness, his whole body settling into calm obedience, so complete it did not look trained. It looked remembered. Jonah was already falling back into exhausted sleep when Mara turned toward the dog. In that quiet white room, with evening light fading across the glass, she understood that the case in front of her had just opened a second door behind it, and whatever waited beyond that door was older than Harlem, older than Jonah, and perhaps older than anyone still believed was relevant. Thursday morning settled over Bramble Falls with a polished kind of brightness, the sort that made even old storefront glass look hopeful. Mara parked across from the Blue Lantern just after 8, with Atlas in the back seat watching the diner through the window, as if he already knew why they had come. The place stood on the corner of Main and Alder, a narrow old-fashioned diner with blue trim, brass handles polished by decades of hands, and a painted lantern above the door that had faded from navy to something softer with time. Inside, the air held coffee, butter, warm bread, and the faint sweetness of maple syrup. It should have felt comforting. To Mara, it felt like the kind of room where people forgot to look closely. She stepped in with Atlas at her side and paused long enough to take in the room. There were contractors in work jackets, a retired teacher with silver curls bent over a crossword, 2 women discussing church flowers, and one waitress weaving between tables with the quick, practiced grace of someone who had balanced plates for half her life. Her name tag read Dottie, and she looked exactly like the kind of woman a small American town depends on, without ever saying so aloud. She was somewhere in her early 60s, round-faced and pink-cheeked, with a cloud of pale auburn hair pinned up too fast, and reading glasses hanging from a chain against her uniform. There was kindness in her, but also order. The kind of woman who noticed whether a man skipped breakfast, whether a widow had stopped talking, whether a stranger looked like trouble before he sat down. Dottie greeted Mara with a nod, then glanced at Atlas and lowered her voice automatically. "You can take the side booth if you want a little room." Mara thanked her, but her gaze had already moved to the far corner by the front window. Calder Finn was exactly where the record said he would be. He sat in a wheelchair angled toward the glass, one hand around a thick white coffee mug, the other resting lightly on a folded newspaper he had not touched in some time. He was in his mid-70s, narrow through the waist, but still broad in the chest beneath a tan wool coat that had clearly been brushed more than once this morning. His hair, once dark, had gone fully silver and lay combed back from a deeply lined forehead. He wore a trimmed white mustache and a short beard that sharpened the structure of his face rather than softening it. There was nothing fragile about him except the chair. Even at rest, he gave the impression of a man who had spent years noticing everything worth noticing and had never learned how to switch that habit off. The townspeople likely saw an old man with quiet manners and a fixed routine. Mara saw something else: the economy of movement, the steady scan of reflections in the window, the peculiar stillness of someone whose awareness had once been trained for harder rooms than this one. She had barely taken 2 steps toward him when Atlas stopped. Not hesitated. Stopped. His ears lifted, his body went tall, and for a breath he seemed to listen to something too old for the room. Mara felt the leash tighten once under her fingers, then loosen. Atlas stepped away from her without strain or confusion, crossed the checkerboard floor in a line so direct it made 2 customers turn their heads, and came to a halt beside Calder's wheelchair. Then, with the calm dignity of a soldier returning to a post he recognized, he sat down. No growl, no warning, no uncertainty. Just peace. Mara's pulse thudded once, hard enough to make the edges of the room sharpen. Calder looked down at Atlas as if the sight did not surprise him at all. If anything, something in his weathered expression turned almost tender, though only for an instant. A spoon slipped from a nearby table and struck the tile with a bright silver crack. The sound rang through the diner, then vanished, leaving behind a silence so clean Mara could hear Atlas breathe. Calder lifted his eyes to Mara. They were pale blue, faded but not dim, the eyes of a winter sky after a storm has passed. "You brought him here because of a word," he said. It was not a question. Mara crossed the remaining distance slowly and stood across from him. "A man in federal protection spoke something in his sleep last night," she said. "My dog reacted like he'd heard an order buried deeper than his current training." Calder's fingers tapped once against the mug, more memory than habit. Then he bent slightly toward Atlas and spoke a quiet phrase in a low, even tone. It was not English, at least not entirely. The syllables were soft-edged, shaped with care rather than force. Atlas exhaled and lowered his head, not submissive, not asleep, simply settled in complete trust. That was all Mara needed. She slid into the booth across from Calder. Dottie approached, set down coffee without asking, and left with one curious glance that held more town wisdom than gossip. Calder waited until she was gone before speaking again. "My name must have looked half erased in whatever file you found," he said. "It did?" Mara replied, "which usually means somebody once mattered." That drew the faintest shadow of a smile. Or somebody once embarrassed the right people. Calder told his story the way men of his generation often told painful truths, plainly, with as little ceremony as possible. Decades earlier, he had served as a technical consultant on a federal canine field program designed for severe weather, long-range recovery, and silent control under difficult conditions. Not a public hero, not a poster figure, but an architect of methods. Layered response structures, calming overrides, deep command frameworks that later evolved into standard training foundations. Then came an operation, an injury, a chair, and the slow bureaucratic burial that follows work too sensitive for pride and too useful to truly disappear. His name had been left behind while his methods traveled on without him. Mara took out her phone and showed him the photo of Jonah's wrist, the braided cord mark, then the image of the scrap they had recovered. The change in Calder was slight, but unmistakable. His shoulders went still in a different way, and the softness left his face. "I've seen that pattern before," he said. "Not the cord itself, the routing logic behind it." He asked for a napkin and drew a few lines with the diner pen, quick and sure, old paper mills, rail spurs, loading culverts, transfer points forgotten by the public and remembered only by bad men and county maps no one updated properly. He explained that the region had never erupted into one visible case because the activity had been scattered with care. One incident became a work accident, another became a civil transport dispute. A missing hour here, a miscoded emergency call there, different jurisdictions, different databases, tiny things, unless someone knew how to read the pattern under the noise. "And somebody local is helping it stay noisy," Mara said. Calder nodded. "That part I'd bet my last dollar on." He asked where the survivor had been found. When Mara told him, he closed his eyes for a moment, not from weakness, but calculation. Then he reached into the canvas satchel hanging from the back of his chair and drew out an old folded map, yellowed at the edges and softened by use. He spread it over the table between the coffee mugs. The paper mill district appeared in faded lines and pencil notes, including service tunnels, maintenance routes, disused access roads, and drainage channels that no modern planning file would bother to carry forward. "There," he said finally, tapping one point with his forefinger. Black Hollow Paper Mill. The name sat between them like a stone dropped in clear water. Mara looked down at the mark on the map and felt something colder than fear move through her. Black Hollow was not tucked deep in some distant wilderness. It lay close enough to Bramble Falls to share its weather, its school routes, its church bells, its morning bakery deliveries. Close enough to hide not by distance, but by familiarity. She folded the map with careful hands. Atlas remained at Calder's side until Mara rose. Only then did the old man look at the dog one more time, his expression half memory, half warning. "There's something in him that still remembers," Calder said quietly. Mara followed his gaze to Atlas, then back to the map in her hand. Outside, sunlight poured over the tidy street and the parked trucks and the bright windows of a town that believed it knew itself. But now she understood what the peace of Bramble Falls had been covering all along. Jonah had not been taken somewhere far from human life. He had been hidden beneath the dust and routine of it. By Friday morning, Bramble Falls looked almost offensively innocent. Sunlight slid over church steeples, pickup trucks, bakery windows, and wet pavement still drying from the night's thaw. Mara Quinn sat at a borrowed desk inside a small side office at the sheriff's annex, the old map from Calder Finn spread beside her laptop like a ghost refusing to stay buried. Atlas lay under the window, head on his paws, his amber eyes half closed but never truly resting. The office heater ticked in the corner. Somewhere beyond the door, a copier whirred, a deputy laughed too loudly, and the world kept pretending that paperwork and weather were the only things worth noticing. Mara had spent enough years in federal work to know that evil rarely announced itself in a grand shape. More often, it arrived as administrative dust, a wrong label, a missing timestamp, a report filed under the gentlest possible word. She began laying the fragments side by side. Harlem, the stolen e-bike battery, the fatal crash that had looked like reckless chaos but now felt more like a curtain pulled at the right moment. Jonah Vance abducted but kept alive. A relay corridor shifted north. Civilian injury reports in Bramble Falls that seemed unrelated unless someone read them in the right order. Missing deliveries, odd freight detours. One fear-struck man at urgent care who had sworn he slipped at work, though June said his hands had trembled like a man expecting punishment. The pattern did not run in a straight line. It moved like water under floorboards, choosing the cracks no one thought to seal. June Halpern arrived just before 10 with 2 paper cups and a folder under her arm. Her blonde hair was tied back in a practical knot today, and the freckles across her nose looked darker after time outdoors. She had changed into charcoal scrubs beneath a heavy wool coat, which made her seem half medic, half tired farm daughter, a woman built by service and weather. She set the coffee down and opened the folder with the quiet purpose of someone who disliked drama and trusted evidence more than fear. She had spent the early hours reviewing non-criminal medical calls from the last 3 months. Not confidential details beyond what she could ethically flag, but enough to show a shape. 3 laborers, all temporary workers, had come through local care points with the same combination of symptoms: severe exhaustion, dehydration, minor restraint marks mistaken for equipment rub, and a frightened refusal to explain where they had been. One had spoken only Spanish until he realized no one planned to hand him back to anyone. Another had begged not to have his employer notified. A third disappeared before discharge papers were complete. "It's the same look," June said softly. "Not the injury. The look, like they don't think the room is safe yet." Mara nodded. That sentence stayed with her. A safe room was not defined by locks or law. It was defined by whether a frightened person believed pain would follow the truth. She spent the next hour moving between transport manifests, archived traffic cameras, and the county's shared incident system. That was where the ugliness began to reveal its manners. Reports had not been erased. That would have been clumsy. They had been softened, rerouted, recoded. A loading dock collapse listed with no follow-up photos. A roadside distress call entered under vehicle trouble instead of suspicious activity. A warehouse light complaint filed as a utility issue. The same approving digital signature appeared in the correction history more than once. Owen Pritchard, Deputy County Safety Coordinator. Mara pulled up his personnel file. He was 46, thick through the shoulders, with a high hairline, close-clipped brown hair going gray at the temples, and a square, respectable face made for public meetings and budget reassurances. In his official photo, he wore a sensible tie and the expression of a man who prided himself on being useful. Men like Owen often built their reputations on calm. Sometimes they built their crimes there, too. His record showed 10 years in municipal compliance after a career-ending construction fall had left him with a stiff knee and a bitterness, according to one old performance note, toward outsiders dictating local priorities. Mara had met that type before. Injury had not made them cruel, but it had narrowed their mercy until only their own grievances still fit inside it. The monitor flashed white for half a second, then went black, and the office dropped into a silence so sudden Mara could hear Atlas's claws click once against the floor. In that tiny pause, before the backup screen returned, she felt the case breathe. When the image came back, the missing seconds seemed louder than any alarm. Not a power failure, not random. Someone had triggered a brief interruption in the shared system from a remote terminal on the county network. Mara traced the action log fast, her pulse steady and hard. The access point had bounced through a maintenance office near the industrial fringe south of town, not far from the old Black Hollow tract. Atlas was already standing. By noon, Mara and Atlas were moving along the outskirts of the abandoned paper corridor while a discreet federal team held farther back. She had no intention of announcing herself before she had something worth holding. The land near Black Hollow had a tired look to it, as though industry had left decades ago but had taken the future with it. Low sheds leaned in the wind. Corrugated metal roofs flashed dull silver through the trees. The old paper mill itself stood deeper in, its skeletal upper works cut against the pale sky like the ribs of some enormous dead machine. Calder had been right about one thing that chilled Mara more than she cared to admit. It was close. Far too close. Close enough for a person to drive past it, thinking only of groceries or weather, and never imagine what the earth still remembered underneath. Atlas worked quietly, nose low, moving in arcs around the edge of a boarded lumber shed that county maps still labeled closed. Mara had brought a sealed evidence pouch containing the braided fragment from Jonah's wrist and a cloth from his jacket collar, enough to give Atlas the freshest legal scent line possible. The dog slowed near a drainage rut, then lifted his head toward a narrow service lane half hidden behind stacked pallets gone soft with age. There, at the back of the shed, was a rust-eaten metal door set into concrete. No fresh tire marks showed clearly, but the ground held disturbances too careful to be natural. A scrape, a compressed strip of mud, the faint impression of repeated foot traffic disguised beneath debris. Mara crouched and examined the threshold. The air smelled of damp wood, stale oil, and something else beneath it, something sour with fear and old confinement. She thought of Jonah crawling out through rain and runoff, guided only by endurance and blind instinct. She thought of the migrant workers June had described, men broken into administrative fragments so no one would have to see the whole of them. She thought of Owen Pritchard at his county desk, turning harm into harmless words. Then Atlas stepped closer to the door and let out a low sound, not loud, not wild, only a quiet warning pulled from deep in his chest. It was the kind of sound a faithful creature made when absence itself felt wrong. Mara went still. The shed was empty now. She knew that before she tested the handle. But emptiness had temperature, and this place had been vacated too recently, too carefully. Someone had moved out because someone knew pressure was coming. The scent lingering behind the door was not merely labor or storage. It was panic, fresh enough to feel human. She rose slowly, one hand on Atlas's neck, and looked past the shed toward the skeleton of Black Hollow beyond the trees. The case had changed again. Up to now, she had been listening, watching, assembling. But the people on the other side of this had begun to move and answer. They knew a hand had touched the center of their web. And standing in the cold noon light, with Atlas rigid beside the rusted door, Mara understood that observation was over. The next step would demand something sharper. By Saturday, Bramble Falls had dressed itself in the kind of cheer that made sorrow seem almost impolite. Paper flags fluttered between lampposts. Children in bright jackets ran circles around the lake path, and the town square smelled of apple pies, grilled corn, maple candy, and damp earth waking from winter. A bluegrass trio played beneath a striped canopy. Old men in canvas caps argued warmly over fishing weather, and church ladies arranged jars of daffodils beside raffle baskets, as if beauty itself were a civic duty. Under any other sky, Mara Quinn might have loved it without reservation. She had grown up near places like this, places that believed in bake sales and folded hands and the healing power of saying good morning to strangers. But that morning the sweetness of the festival only sharpened her suspicion. Crowds were cover, music was cover. Happiness, when timed correctly, could be the cleanest disguise in the world. Mara moved through the square in a camel-colored coat over a dark sweater, the federal earpiece hidden beneath her hair. Atlas walking at her left side as if he were only a well-trained dog enjoying the day. He carried himself with the restrained focus of a creature who had learned that the most important moments rarely look dramatic at first. His sable coat gleamed under the spring sun, and children smiled at him from a respectful distance. Mara smiled back when necessary, but her eyes kept moving. Near the cider tent, a plain van idled for too long. At the edge of the lake, two men in work boots scanned the crowd more than they watched the music. In the windows of the hardware store, she caught the reflection of sheriff's annex deputies blending in among the townspeople. This was no raid, not yet. Without the right evidence, it would only scatter the truth. So she watched and listened and let the town believe it was safe for one more hour. June Halpern worked from the temporary first aid station near the bandstand, a white tent with folding cots, bottled water, and an emergency kit lined up in perfect practical order. Her blonde hair was braided today, her scrub top hidden under a red volunteer jacket, and she moved through the small medical station with the same brisk warmth she brought to every frightened person who crossed her path. Across the comm line, her voice stayed calm. She flagged a delivery van that had pulled in behind the pie contest, then noted when it left empty and came back 20 minutes later, riding lower on its axles. Jonah Vance, pale but upright in a surveillance SUV a block away, listened in through a headset. He was not field ready, and everyone knew it, including him. His face still carried the worn look of recent suffering, and his movements had the measured care of a man rebuilding trust with his own body. But his memory remained sharp. He knew voices, patterns, the rhythms of fear inside industrial spaces. Calder Finn, stationed with a pair of maps and a county radio at Dottie's back office in the Blue Lantern, had become the quiet mind behind the operation. Age had thinned his body, but not his judgment. Every time he spoke over the line, Mara heard the same dry precision that once built systems no one ever thanked him for in public. The festival swelled toward noon. Atlas lifted his head near the maple syrup stall and turned sharply toward the lakeside service road. Mara followed his attention and saw a young man unloading crates from a utility truck. He could not have been older than 22. He was slim to the point of hunger, with dark curly hair cropped too close at the sides, olive skin drawn tight over tired cheekbones, and a quick, hunted gaze that never rested in one place for long. His name tag said Mateo Ruiz, though his body language suggested he did not feel ownership of anything, not even his own breath. He moved too fast when no one was watching, and too carefully when they were. Atlas gave one low whine, almost beneath hearing. Mara drifted closer, pretending interest in a row of hand-carved birdhouses while she watched Mateo carry one final crate toward the river path. Then she saw it, the tiny backward glance, not toward authority, but toward somewhere he feared leaving unattended. A burst of applause crashed from the bandstand as the fiddler struck a bright high note, and in that sharp wash of sound, Mateo flinched so hard he nearly dropped the crate. For one strange instant, joy itself sounded like danger. Mara's decision came in the same breath. She left the birdhouse stall, gave Atlas the smallest hand signal, and followed Mateo down the slope beyond the festival tents. The river still wore late winter at its edges, sheets of thinning ice shining in the reeds. Behind a maintenance fence and beneath an old culvert bridge, Mateo finally stopped. When Mara stepped into view and quietly said his name, he recoiled at first, then looked not at her face, but at Atlas. There was no menace in the dog, only grave attention. Something in that steadiness cracked the young man's fear, open just enough for truth to slip through. Mateo worked odd jobs under the table, he told her in halting phrases, cleaning, lifting, loading whatever they asked. After his father lost his job and his mother's health turned delicate, money became the kind of master that disguised itself as necessity. He had not known what he was carrying at first. He had only known that saying no meant losing rent. But 2 nights ago he found a woman hidden in the drainage chamber below the culvert, bound, weak, and barely conscious. He had started bringing her water in secret. He thought he could keep doing it until someone better came. His eyes filled not with self-pity, but with shame for how small his courage had felt. Mara looked into the dark opening beneath the concrete and understood the choice before her. Through the comm line, one federal voice urged patience. Another said a vehicle of interest had just started moving near the south rail spur. If she broke now to recover the witness, the upper link might slip. If she stayed on the trail, the woman below might not survive the hour. Mara closed her eyes for half a beat and felt the answer arrive with perfect simplicity. Justice that stepped over the living to chase the powerful was only ambition with a badge. She went down first. The chamber smelled of cold mud, rust, and frightened sleep. The woman inside was in her 30s, narrow-faced, with dark hair stuck to her temples and skin gone pale with exhaustion. She wore a warehouse fleece 2 sizes too large and stared at Mara with the stunned caution of someone who had forgotten rescue could still be real. Her name was Elena Soria. She had worked shipping records in a Bronx subcontract office before noticing accounts that did not match freight. When she tried to copy the wrong files, someone noticed. Since then, she had been moved north like a parcel with a beating heart. Elena's voice shook, but her memory did not. She gave them what they had not yet possessed, the timing of the final transfer, the alias used by the regional backer, and the fact that Owen Pritchard was not merely smoothing reports, but escorting the last data package out under cover of festival traffic. The net tightened at once. Deputies moved. Federal vehicles cut toward the rail spur. June cleared a path for emergency extraction. Calder confirmed the route from old service maps. Jonah recognized the alias through the headset and quietly said, "That's him." The chase unfolded not in darkness, but in broad spring light, which made it somehow more revealing. A county SUV broke from behind the low warehouses beyond the festival, trying to merge with outbound traffic before anyone realized what it carried. Owen Pritchard was at the wheel, his respectable face now stripped of public composure, all grievance and panic beneath the windshield glare. Mara ran across the thawing gravel with Atlas beside her, the dog's stride long and sure as the vehicle swung toward the old road out of town. Atlas moved before she did. He cut at an angle so precise it looked almost mathematical, reached the lane ahead of the SUV, and forced Owen's reflex to betray him. The man jerked the wheel. The vehicle slewed sideways on wet gravel. A rear door flew open from the sudden turn, and a small black drive case skidded out, bounced once, and broke apart against the slushy edge of the road. Its contents spilled over melting ice like dark seeds. Everything seemed to stop. Mara dropped to one knee and picked up the storage unit with hands that had learned not to tremble until later. Around her, radios crackled, tires hissed, and distant festival music still floated over the water as if the town had not yet understood what had just been uncovered in its own bright afternoon. She looked down at the drive, then at Atlas standing calm and alert in the road, and knew with a clarity that felt almost holy that for the first time they held the thing capable of dragging the hidden half of this case into the sun. In the days after the festival, Bramble Falls did not look like a town that had stood so close to a hidden machine of cruelty. The lake still caught the morning sun like polished glass. The bakery still opened before dawn. Church bells still moved through the clean northern air as if they belonged to a world untouched by corruption. But something had changed beneath the surface. Once the storage unit was opened and verified, the case stopped being rumor, stopped being fragments, stopped being the kind of pain that could be filed away under softer words. The data connected accounts, transfer points, subcontract routes, false incident labels, and names that had spent too long hiding behind committees, logistics firms, and civic language. Owen Pritchard was taken into custody before nightfall, and the men above him began to lose the shelter of distance. What emerged was not merely an illegal transport chain. It was a system that had fed on the silence around vulnerable workers, on the invisibility of delivery drivers, on the exhaustion of men and women too busy surviving to challenge the shape of their own exploitation. The terrible crash in Harlem was no longer treated as a tragic burst of reckless chaos floating alone in public memory. It became what it had always been beneath the noise, part of a wider design that had used confusion as cover and human lives as a cheap shield. Families who had feared their grief would be buried under cold paper finally heard the truth spoken clearly, and though truth does not erase sorrow, it gives sorrow a place to stand. Jonah Vance remained in recovery, and recovery did not come to him like a miracle. It came like weather returning inch by inch. His hand steadied before his sleep did. His appetite returned before his peace of mind. Some mornings he could speak like a man stepping back into himself. Other mornings he seemed to drift somewhere halfway between the hospital room and the old concrete dark he had crawled out of. Mara visited when she could, not always to ask questions. Sometimes she only sat beside the window while Atlas rested near the bed, and the three of them let the quiet do its work. Jonah had the face of a man carved by discipline, but now the strain around his eyes had softened just enough for weariness to show honestly. A week after the arrests began, he was strong enough to meet the other two SEALs who had made it out before him. The first was Nathan Rowe, a tall, weathered man with close-cropped black hair, bronze skin, and a scar at the edge of his chin that gave his calm expression a permanent hint of severity. The second was Eli Mercer, broader and fairer, with sandy hair, a broken nose that had healed slightly crooked, and the kind of quiet humor that often grows inside men who have seen too much and learned to spend words carefully. Neither man walked into Jonah's room with speeches. They entered like brothers returning to a house after a storm. Nathan put a hand on Jonah's shoulder. Eli gave one small nod, then looked away for a second, because sometimes relief is too large to face directly. The room held almost no language, yet it held more healing than most conversations ever do. They had not all come back untouched, but they had come back enough to be seen by one another again, and sometimes that is the first true mercy. Outside the recovery wing, a gust struck the flagpole, and the metal clip snapped hard against the halyard, bright and sudden as a struck bell. For one still breath, every head in the room lifted, and then the silence that followed felt gentler than before. Mara closed the case with the kind of tired clarity that only comes after a long season of doubt. She had arrived in Bramble Falls carrying a task disguised as leave, telling herself she was only there to observe, to confirm, to listen for one faint thread. But the place had asked something larger of her. It had asked her to look at her own home ground without sentimentality, to admit that beauty and concealment sometimes wear the same face. June understood that before Mara did. She was the one who helped turn the town's shame into something living and useful. With support from local churches, small businesses, and two families who had lost loved ones to transport violence, June started a modest relief fund for injured delivery workers and temporary laborers caught between false employers and real danger. It was not grand. It had no polished slogan. It began with folding chairs, a pie auction, a coffee tin for cash donations, and a handwritten sign taped to the window of the Blue Lantern. That was exactly why it mattered. It came from people who had finally stopped saying, "Somebody should do something," and had instead placed their own hands on the task. The recognition for Calder Finn came a few days later on a clear afternoon with just enough wind to keep the spring air honest. It was held behind a federal training facility on the edge of Albany, in a modest yard marked by short white posts, a narrow row of flags, and a patch of clipped grass still pale from winter. No crowd, no news cameras, no polished grandstanding. Just a handful of handlers standing straight in their field jackets, one senior unit commander reading a short statement, and Calder in his wheelchair wearing a dark blazer that sat a little loose across his chest. He looked older outdoors than he had in the diner, not weaker, only more fully visible. Time had settled on him, but it had not defeated him. When the commander spoke of foundational service and methods still alive in present canine architecture, Calder's mouth tightened once, as if gratitude arriving late had to travel farther to reach him. Mara stood a few feet behind him, and Atlas sat at her side until she released the lead. Then the German shepherd rose, walked forward with grave composure, and stopped in front of the old man. He sat. Then slowly, with the solemn gentleness only a loyal animal can give without embarrassment, he rested his head on Calder's knee. No one moved. No one tried to improve the moment with extra words. It felt like a bow offered on behalf of all the working dogs who had come after, and like an answer to years in which Calder's name had lived nowhere but in old systems and private memory. Mara saw Calder's hand tremble once before it settled on the thick sable fur between Atlas's ears. Later, when the case files had been sent where they needed to go and the lake road had turned green again at the edges, Mara returned to the path where Atlas had first changed direction. The birch trees had begun to leaf. Grass pushed through the old gravel in thin, determined blades. The hollow where Jonah had been found looked smaller now, less like a wound in the land and more like a place waiting to be understood. Mara stood there a long time with one hand resting lightly on Atlas's lead. She was still the same woman who had come back from Albany carrying unfinished duty in her chest, but she no longer felt divided from the place that raised her. Bramble Falls had shown her its beauty, and then its shadow, and then the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose not to look away. She felt Atlas lift his head and look at her first, then toward the bright road ahead, where sunlight lay across the path in long gold bands. Mara gave the lead the gentlest touch. The dog leaned forward, ready but unhurried. And there, beside the lake, with the wind moving softly through the birches, the story came to rest in a simple truth. Some destinies do not arrive with thunder. They arrive in the nearly silent turning of a faithful dog who knows, before anyone else, where the lost should be found. This story reminds us that the world is still full of quiet people carrying unseen burdens, and sometimes the bravest souls are the ones sitting silently beside us, asking for nothing. It also reminds us that animals are not just creatures passing through our lives. They are gifts of loyalty, comfort, and love. A faithful dog may not speak with words, but through devotion, courage, and gentle instinct, it can reveal truths that human eyes often miss. In that way, love itself becomes a language deeper than fear. The lesson in this story is simple but powerful. Never ignore the broken, never overlook the humble, and never assume that a small act of kindness cannot change the direction of a life. One caring choice, one moment of mercy, one hand reaching down, or one animal refusing to give up on a human soul can become the very beginning of healing. Sometimes what looks like coincidence is really grace arriving quietly. In everyday life, many people are fighting hidden battles. The tired delivery worker, the lonely veteran, the struggling neighbor, the frightened stranger, even the animal wandering without a home. All may be carrying pain we cannot see, That is why we must choose patience over harshness, compassion over indifference, and goodness over comfort. Love is not proven in grand speeches. It is proven in daily kindness, in the way we treat the weak, the forgotten, and the voiceless. And perhaps that is where the miracle lives. Not always in thunder, not always in something dazzling, but in the gentle timing of God. In the right soul arriving at the right place. In a loyal dog leading someone toward truth. In a life being spared just long enough for hope to return. Sometimes the hand of God moves so softly that we only understand it later. But when we look back, we see that heaven had not forgotten anyone. So let this story be a call to live better, be kinder, protect the weak, speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. Love animals with tenderness because they reflect a purity of heart that many people spend their whole lives trying to recover. Feed the hungry, notice the lonely. Offer grace where the world offers coldness. And when life gives you the chance to help, do not look away. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in kindness, miracles, and the healing bond between people and animals. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us if you believe God sometimes sends help in ways we do not expect. Subscribe to the channel to stay with more stories of hope, faith, courage, and love. May God bless you, your family, and every gentle heart watching today. May He protect those who are weary, comfort those who are grieving, guide those who feel lost, and surround your home with peace. And may He bless every animal who brings light, loyalty, and love into this world. Amen.